Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Melissa Murray, and I am the Frederick I. and Grace Stokes Professor of Law here at NYU, where I am also the Faculty Director for the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the historic Supreme Court nomination of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson and to discuss the ins and outs of what we can expect from the upcoming confirmation process. As we move from Black History Month to Women's History Month, we'll also explore why identity is so key to the conversation around this particular nomination, from President Biden's pledge to nominate a Black woman to how Judge Jackson's identity is already informing her reception as a nominee. And to do so, we are thrilled to welcome an all-star panel on these issues tonight. And we are especially grateful to our co-sponsors for making this a truly collaborative event at NYU Law. Our co-sponsors tonight include the Law Alumni of Color Association, LACA, the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law, the Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, the American Constitution Society, the Black Allied Law Students Association, BALSA, the Women of Color Collective, and Law Women. Thank you so much for your collaboration on this event. Before I introduce our moderator tonight, a few logistics to get us started. First of all, live captioning is available via the caption feature, so please avail yourself of that. And if you have questions during the program, we welcome your questions. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can with our panelists. And now I'm delighted to introduce our moderator, Alicia Menendez. We are welcoming Alicia back to the BWLN. She's an anchor at MSNBC and the host of American Voices with Alicia Menendez. She also hosts a podcast, Latina to Latina, and she is the author of The Likeability Trap, How to Break Free and Succeed as You Are. And you can find a book talk video on The Likeability Trap on the BWLN website. It was one of our most interesting events last year. We're thrilled to have Alicia here with us tonight, and I'm honored to turn it over to her to introduce our esteemed panel. Thank you.
Melissa Murray, thank you so much. It's like fun to hang out with you on a weekday. Normally we are relegated to the weekends together, so it is good to see you in your space. I'm so happy to be here. And I want to say, I have a list of questions for our amazing panelists, but if you have questions, I am really here to facilitate the conversation, make sure that we bring them in. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Amy Allison. Amy is the founder and president of She the People. They are the nation's leading organization dedicated to an America redefined and inspired by women of color. Very appropriate tonight. She builds national, inclusive, multiracial coalitions to show the power of women of color, increase voter engagement, and advocate for racial, economic, and gender justice. Amy holds a BA in history and an MA in education from Stanford University. Debo Adigble is a partner and chair of the anti-discrimination practice at WilmerHale. He also serves as a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Tonight, we are also looking forward to drawing on his past experience as senior counsel for the Senate Judiciary Committee and as acting president and director of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, for which he argued two major voting rights cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. That includes Shelby County versus Holder. He holds a BA from Connecticut College and a JD from NYU Law, and he serves on the board of trustees for both schools. Finally, Tiffany Gardner is the CEO of Reflect Us, a national nonpartisan coalition working to increase the number of women in office and achieve equal representation across the racial, ideological, ethnic, and geographic spectrum. A former Skadden attorney, she holds a BA from Yale, a JD from NYU Law, and an LLM in human rights law from Columbia. Woo! All right, well, it's the smartest, most qualified panel I have ever spoken with, which makes sense given what it is that we're going to talk about. And I want to do a quick, what I call in TV, a whip with all of you, where I ask you all the same question just to sort of set the stage. And that is, Amy, I'm going to start with you. What will it mean for Judge Jackson to be on this court?
Well, we've got to reflect that 233 years, a Black woman has never been part of one of the three branches of U.S. government, and that she's going to bring with her not only lived experience and exceptional qualifications, but someone who's got impeccable character and is going to widen the perspectives and the interpretations of law and the Constitution. And what's that mean for us? It means that for millions of us Black women, we finally have an opportunity to see ourselves reflected in the highest court of the land. But it's more than that. I think the opportunity and the significance is not just for those of us in this country now, but for the next generation, that it's going to forever change what a Supreme Court justice looks like and what what it's like to honorably serve this nation, and who is both should be leading us and should be looked at for the interpretation of laws in order to make it more and more just. It's a very exciting moment for the country.
Gabriel, same question.
So I think Amy captured it very well. And I guess I would just add that first and foremost, the court would have a new justice who's an exceptional jurist and public servant who has given a lot of her life and her career to serving her country and has distinguished herself in a variety of roles. I would note also that it's significant because she would only be the 6th woman ever on the United States Supreme Court, the 3rd African-American ever on the Supreme Court in the history of the nation, the 4th person of color on the Supreme Court, and she would be the first public defender ever to sit on the Supreme Court. And for those keeping the trivia score at home, she would be the 3rd Justice Jackson to sit on the Supreme Court. But she's an extraordinary lawyer, a great talent. She has been a thoughtful judge. And I think for all the reasons that Amy said, and all of those additional reasons, we are all amalgamations of our different life experiences and the way in which we have walked in the world personally and professionally. And I think the perspective that she would bring to bear, as well as her legal acumen, would be a great tribute to the nation, and that it would be a history-making confirmation.
Tiffany?
Well, I think Amy and Davo sort of stole my thunder in many respects. And
You have more thunder, Tiffany. I don't buy that. Don't buy for a second.
And I say, if anyone's going to steal my thunder, let it be these two. But you know, in addition to what's already been said, the only thing I'll add is as I reflect upon this moment and really moments over the past couple of years in our union, I think about the trajectory of our country, of the court. In fact, one of the first cases that the court decided around sex discrimination was in 1873 in Bradwell v. Illinois, where the court declared that it was okay for a state to bar a woman from practicing law. And here we are now, right? So that trajectory. So for me, while there is quite a bit of work still to do in our country, in our land, and folks are doing that good work, for me, this is a huge representation to how far we've come. We still have a far way to go, don't get me wrong, but it's a celebratory moment. And it's a moment that for those of us fighting the good fight can feel that progress is being made. And I think we can, at least for now, stop and celebrate that.
Tiffany, I do want to ask you, because we're having a conversation about identity and one's background, whether that is professional background, lived experience. We've talked about what that means for people living in the country now, what it may mean for the future, our perception of what a jurist is. What does it mean for the actual work, right? What does it mean, the lived experience, the work experience that someone brings to the bench?
You know, so that's a good question. So in the work that I do as CEO Reflect Us, we're working across the country to get more women elected at the local, state, and federal level. So I come up against this a lot, right? Why women, right? What's the difference between having a woman elected official, a woman jurist, a woman senator, a woman VP, right? Versus a man, honestly. And you know what I say about that, the importance of it is, if I can step back just for a minute, because sometimes I balk at that comment, because sort of underlaid in that comment is the understanding of what's normative, right? And sort of making white maleness normative. right? So when we have a white male, let's say, of privilege that's on the court, that's in the Senate, right? That's in, you know, the VP role, the question of one's diversity doesn't come out. It's just his lived experience, right? And so I will push back that with respect to Judge Jackson, my gosh, her lived experience is going to be so hugely important. Yes, as a woman, yes, as an African-American, as it would be for any individual that would come into that role, right? So I started that everyone's bringing their perspective, no matter what your background is. So not to make it so unique, right? That the person is a woman, that the person is a person of color, because we're knowing that everyone's bringing in their lived experience. So just kind of want to level set in that way for a minute. With that being said, what I would say is for so long, and Dable, you already, you know, mentioned this, since 1789, right, when the Supreme Court, you know, first began its work, you didn't have a Black woman on the court. So you had perspectives that were very homogeneous in that way. And so by her being on the court, she will bring her perspective that will be unique in many ways as a woman, as a Black woman, through her experiences, and really makes it more reflective of the US populace, right? And the lived experiences of US citizens more broadly and more generally. And I think that's what excites me about this. So not so much that as a Black woman, as a Black person, as a woman, this is so unique, but knowing that we're all bringing our unique perspectives in, and this is just one voice. I would put it like this. This is one voice that hasn't been heard over the past several centuries. Thank you, or several, centuries. Thank you.
Well, speaking to lived experience, Debo, you served in the nominations unit for the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. You were also someone who has experienced the process as a nominee, and particularly as a nominee of color. Can you talk to us a little bit both about the preparation that goes into this? I mean, we know that she is like locked in a room right now doing murder boards, right? She is anticipating every question, every attack they're going to throw her way. We know that the Congressional Black Caucus has set up a war room so that they are anticipating and prepping. Can you sort of pull back the curtain and give us a sense of what that all looks like?
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, she has one advantage in that she has been before the committee before. And so she's been through this process. This is not her first time going through it, and she knows what she needs to do, and she's prepared for it. She's been confirmed a number of times, including garnering Republican votes in her many roles, both as a judge and on the U.S. Sentencing Commission. But in terms of giving a little window into what the process looks like, you do have to think about the full sweep of your career. Before the hearing starts, you have to submit what is called the Senate Judiciary Questionnaire. And it's a long document in which you catalog the full sweep of your legal experience from the various early days, every job, every experience, every Supreme Court brief you filed, if that's been part of your practice, laying it all out there so that the Senate Judiciary Committee can have adequate information to dig into your record, understand your professional trajectory and your views of the Constitution if they've been expressed, and to make an assessment of what type of lawyer you are. And so that's sort of the straightforward part of digging into your credentials. But this is also a political process. And part of the way in which the political process unfolds, and that we've seen, is that candidates, nominees, I should say, for high offices often find themselves with supporters in the current context, supporters of from one party and detractors from another party. It doesn't always line up in exactly that way, but very often when you have folks that are opposed to your nomination, part of the theory is for them to try and paint you outside of the norm of lawyers, of legal experience, and to try and otherize you, either because of your opinions or because of some narratives that they're trying to introduce into the dialogue. And in the media, we've already seen a little bit of that. Sometimes candidates of color, nominees of color, will have their credentials questioned. People will ask about their expertise, and sometimes there are questions that you don't see other types of nominees get. For example, I recently heard that some person was somewhat absurdly asking about what Judge Jackson's LSAT, or law school entry, scores were on the law school entry test. I've never heard a professional context in which somebody's law school entry score was relevant to anything, particularly not for somebody who has served for a judge for more years than many of the sitting justices on the court. In fact, she served as a judge for a longer period of time than the aggregate time that 4 of the justices spent before they went to the court. So the idea that this is a person who's not ready for prime time and not ready to continue to serve her country with yet another confirmation is really not a serious question. And indeed, I think Mitch McConnell has acknowledged her qualifications. So the question will be, what is the narrative that folks try and drive? If those folks that might try and stand in the way of her confirmation, how will there be an attempt to otherize her? But I think she's well up to it, and I think that the facts will speak, and I expect her to be sitting on the high court.
Amy, you had sort of a similar framing, which is that the confirmation holds both possibilities and dangers. And I wonder what you see as those possibilities and those dangers.
I wanted to pick up on the comment, really beautifully said, that Debo had about otherizing. Black women know, along with other women of color, what it's like to not be the norm, as Tiffany said, to be painted as someone who's not worthy. And this is one of those extraordinary national moments for the country to be focused on the excellence, the readiness, the experience, the impeccable, credentials of this nominee and what she brings. It's her lived experience that qualifies her even more. And the danger is that through the confirmation and questioning process, she is questioned by senators that question her personhood, her the fact that, does she deserve to be here? Is the fact that she looks different than anyone else who's ever been nominated, does that disqualify her? And our job, and the great possibility for that, is to defend in an unapologetic way that her experience, which is so impressive, and who she is as a person, including being a Black woman, is the very thing the country needs on the court right now. And I think about the confirmation process of another great judge, our Supreme Court Judge Sotomayor, when her background was questioned, people could say any kinds of things about whether she deserved to be on the court because no one had looked like her or sounded like her. But I think about the great potential of confirming Sonia Sotomayor, and as Sherilyn Ifill wrote in the New York Times in a wonderful opinion piece that was out yesterday, people should check out, talked about Sotomayor's unique voice, even when someone who's dedicated to the expansion of justice and bringing those perspectives may be outvoted, as will be the case with Judge Jackson with a conservative majority, that the voice of dissent helps to destabilize what's considered normal, helps to open up cultural space so that more Black women and other women of color are not being otherized in that same way. And that cultural space can actually happen in a moment where the country's focused on the confirmation process and the question answer process. So we got to be ready. I'm very happy to hear the NAACP is preparing support, that the Congressional Black Caucus is preparing support, and that those who are in a position to talk to Judge Jackson about her experience, not tolerate one bit of the kind of thing that Black women are so used to, which is to question whether they belong. Black women belong, and Judge Jackson belongs. And so I'm hoping that comes out of this moment.
Right. Prove yourself again. I mean, I think about it in the context of Sotomayor and, even some liberal critics who at the time, suggested to President Obama, she's, quote, not as smart as she thinks she is. And then years later are calling her one of the greatest parts of his legacy, given her contributions to the court and the unique voice that she has cultivated in this moment. I mean, Tiffany, this is not the first time we've seen this movie.
You're absolutely right. In fact, once President Biden, had signaled that he would be selecting an African-American woman, you had advocates and leaders on the ground already preparing for this. So as a part of our coalition, Higher Heights is one of the organizations in our coalition, and they're really the engine in this country getting Black women elected. And they had a whole campaign to support whoever the nominee would be. I was just on a call a couple of days ago with some White House folks, and talking about the strategy of the nominee. And to Amy's point, and it wasn't a strategy of her qualifications, what one would think would be a strategy for a Supreme Court justice, right? The question should be asked, but how do we get around her being a Black woman and the potentially unfair critiques or questionings, as we've been discussing here, that she will get? And what we've seen, even outside of this nomination, but again, generally when women run for office, and in particular Black women, is the sexism and the racism that they encounter when women run for office. This is an appointed position, but it's the same thing. Their hairstyles, their clothing, their likability. So all of this is very permeated in the general society. And it just really percolates up to the top when you're talking about a nomination of this caliber and of this high profile nature. And so the one thing that I am happy to see in this moment is that we've seen this before, as you said. And so now both those who are in support of her, but honestly, as I'm talking to, advocates and leaders throughout the country, those who are in support of democracy, right, are now getting behind this, saying, okay, how do we get in front of this thing so that this doesn't become, again, a thing of, racist tropes or sexist tropes, and we get out of the real conversations that this nation needs to have about justice, about Supreme Court justices, about her nomination, and it really becomes the dialogue that we need versus getting distracted by quite honestly, all this other nonsense that often gets, put into the conversation when you're talking about women leaders, and in particular, women leaders of color. And then in particular, when you're talking about Blackness, which is what this is also about.
Debo, I was on MSNBC with Melissa Murray. We're speaking with Ali Mistal, who posited that, that Judge Jackson was always seen as the pick to replace Breyer. She was seen as the Breyer replacement prior to then candidate Biden saying that he was making a commitment to appointing a Black woman to the bench. And that is because she ideologically is seen very much in the mold of Breyer. And so there's a question here that I want you to answer, but I want to weave my own question into it as well. It's from Peter Balch, who says, share your opinions about Justice Jackson's potential ability to persuade her fellow justices towards a more liberal jurisprudence. Is that even what she is there to do, Debo?
Well, everybody has to decide how they navigate. It's different, even though she's been a judge, being a justice with 8 others, and trying to figure out the way in which the opinions that are circulated might persuade people, definitely in the court conferences talking about the cases. It's very clear, and there's been a lot of interesting history written about the way in which Thurgood Marshall was a very important voice for the court and brought to bear a perspective based on his litigation experience, his experience serving the country, traveling the country, seeing the wounds that have been faced in our nation, understanding the rights of the accused in a way that other justices perhaps did not have up close familiarity with. Justice O'Connor wrote eloquently about all the ways in which Thurgood was a special voice. And so lawyering and judging is about the legal precedents, it's about the legal arguments, it's about the facts. And I think Justice Ketanji Brown, once confirmed, will be in a position to bring to bear her roles as a lawyer, as a Black woman living in America, and as a trial court judge, of which there are not many on the Supreme Court right now, in ways that will marshal her legal arguments, and I'm quite sure will be persuasive. everybody has to think about the way in which they go about it to the extent that that's their goal. There are some justices that are more ideological and want to state their views and have them clearly stated, and perhaps aren't thinking about persuasion in, as between the other members of the court. But my expectation would be that Justice Ketanji Brown, who's committed to the craft of lawyering and a very meticulous lawyer and judge, will be a persuasive voice. How that bears out, nobody can really know on the front end. And one of the things we know about confirmations and about Supreme Court history is that you don't always know what type of justice a nominee will be. And that's something that plays out over a considerable period of time. And the other thing we know is these people serve for decades and decades in most circumstances. So how that evolves, how that moves over time, what the court looks like in the future, these are all questions that remain open. And we can speculate about them right now, but I don't think that there is anybody that has a reliable opinion about how that would play out. And I think if you were able to ask the nominee herself, she wouldn't really know, because that's something that is in the future and that you have to come to understand what are the practices of the body and what are the opportunities to marshal your arguments to be persuasive. And I think that's something that people will learn on the job, frankly.
I too have learned to be suspicious of prognosticators on complicated subject matters. Amy, anything you wanted to add to that conversation about ideology?
That Black women as a group should be understood as the group who, out of all Americans, are the most likely to show up in the voting booth, are some of the most prolific organizers, not just of Black people, but of a broader multiracial groups of people in service to justice issues. And there's every indication that Judge Jackson is going to be a jurist who represents a majority of Black women in terms of someone who's committed to a long line of expanding, is to be a counterpoint to what has looked like a clear path to dismantling civil rights and protections under the law. That's what it seems like the conservative majority on the Supreme Court, the two Trump appointees, and seem to be committed to, and includes the right of Americans to have abortions, protection of your right to vote, a lot of really fundamental things that affect our lives. Everything about her experience thus far and everything that we know is that she'll reflect, I believe, where the majority of Black women are at. It's not to say that people aren't individuals and there's no diversity of thought, but I do believe as a judge, she'll come into the Supreme Court more in a Sonia Sotomayor or a Thurgood Marshall tradition, which is to look at the Constitution and the law and her personal commitment to expanding justice under the law. So I'm saying that to say that, when we look at the opportunity, it is true, we can't look in a crystal ball. I mean, certainly people were saying Justice Sotomayor was a prosecutor, so she's going to bring that, and she's been one of the greatest voices on the Supreme Court. And we are going to see her evolve. It's a lifetime appointment. But there's just so much to be excited about to help build a decades-long increasing bulwark against those who would take away rights that we'd established during Thurgood Marshall's time. And I think that's what the potential of her being on the court brings.
There's a question here from Melina that gets to the question that I wanted to ask. Tiffany, I'm going to start with you. Melina writes, much has been made of the lack of educational diversity among justices, and much of it seems to be bad faith attempts to undermine the historic nature of Judge Jackson's nomination. How have Judge Jackson's supporters navigated balancing the need to combat these bad faith attacks with it's moving as I'm asking it. Hold on, people are loading. Okay, you got the question though, which is that's a thing we heard a lot. And the question I want to weave into it is like, we're talking right now about diversity in the context of race and gender, but what are the other types of diversity we need to be thinking about in the context of the court?
That's an amazing question. I want to piggyback quickly off of Amy's last comments, just very quickly. I think when we talk about Judge Jackson, educational diversity. We know that she attended Miami public school system, right, which is quite unique. We know that she was a public defender, which is quite unique. We also know that she graduated magna cum laude from Harvard. Okay, talking about 0.001% of the world population has been able to do that. Myself included. Okay. We also know that she graduated cum laude from Harvard, and she was on Harvard Law Review. So I just want to make sure that we put out there that this is a brilliant, brilliant woman, right? So whether we agree with her policies or not, whether once she gets on the bench, she does what the majority or supermajority or the minority of us want her to do, just taking, and this is what makes me excited. This is this moment we see this Black woman where you are normalizing Black woman excellence in this way. We're talking about 0.001% here. Outside of all of this, outside of her being a woman, outside of her being a Black woman, she gets cream of the crop. She gets nominated, wonderful. She doesn't get nominated, not so wonderful. But let's just pause and say she's cream of the crop in any category you put her in, period. Regarding educational diversity. So Justice Barrett is the first justice, woman justice did not graduate from an Ivy League institution. I personally do think that that is an issue. I think it's an issue across the board in our country in terms of when we talk about political leadership, legal leadership in this way, right? Who we are pulling, who we are calling from, right? By and large, it is Ivy League, schools like NYU. I'm a proud alum of NYU, but schools of that caliber, right? And I do think, and I was talking to my staff today about this, is that when you talk about the diversity of thought, the diversity of lived experience that we need in this country to grapple with and wrestle with some of these big issues that we have to handle, you do need that diversity. And my challenge would be that as we move forward, and hopefully we're progressing forward in this country, that we really do begin to think about the different types of diversity outside of the racial paradigm. And the racial paradigm is hugely important, don't get me wrong. And the gender paradigm is hugely important, don't get me wrong. But one of the things that I do think we're missing in this country is a real critical analysis of economic diversity. This is the one country I say where we really don't have poor people, but we do. But we don't have active conversations around that. We really don't have working class people. And so for me, what I would love to see when we think about the diversity of the court is thinking about different institutions that we're pulling from, right? Getting out of Harvard, getting out of the Ivy League, looking at some of our state schools and some of the brilliance that is coming out of there, getting into middle America, right? Our Midwest schools, that we just don't hear that perspective. So that is something that I challenge us, obviously, LGBTQ+, that diversity, disability diversity. So really thinking, again, holistically about the human experience, right? And making sure that we are holistically tapping from the talent that is there in our country, representing all the various identities. Last thing I'll say is I do believe that diverse leadership just makes better decision-making across the board. I do believe that. And so with that onus in mind, I would like to see us move not away from, but to broaden what we think of as diversity and make sure that we're capturing these other very important identities as well.
I just wanted to add, Alicia, if I could, a lot of people don't understand that there's been over a dozen justices that were nominated and confirmed in the Supreme Court that weren't even judges. I mean, I think in our lifetime, Earl Warren, who was a governor, was nominated and confirmed on the Supreme Court. I think about the vast majority of Supreme Court justices who had those credentials, just like Tiffany was saying, but also experience. So what I don't want to see in this confirmation process is a questioning of credentials or experience when Judge Jackson carries more than many of the white guys who've served on the Supreme Court. And the danger we have here is by all of a sudden having really high standards that she reaches and saying, actually, they should be higher. Exactly. So this is what Black women, I will just speak for myself, have experienced my whole life. You got to be twice as good to be considered half as good. And that is a danger that people are actually forgetting. With the Supreme Court, a branch of our government has been dominated by white guys who didn't even have the qualifications of experience as a judge. And the more that we can ground ourselves in the reality of this political process, the more confident we can be in, not only just defending the fact that Judge Jackson should be on the court, but saying we need more people like Judge Jackson who come from different backgrounds. I mean, Black women, for example, I don't know, I think there's around 40, you can correct me if I'm wrong, around 40, they're in the district courts and these kind of state courts that are feeding ground, places where they pick nominees from, but because so few had been nominated and confirmed because of a system that excluded Black women, it looks like there's not that many. It's not that there aren't really qualified people. So let us not allow, in the name of holding some kind of false standard, try to question the expanded experience and view that Judge Jackson and other people that might come after her bring to the court.
I'm going to throw this question from the audience to the group, and then if someone wants to grab it. This is from Sharnan, who says, I'm curious about whether the appointment of Black justices to the Supreme Court has shown any actual improvement in promoting Black justice through cases. We touched upon that a little, but if there's any room for expansion there.
Well, I'll take a pass at this. So there is not a lot of experience in this category, so we have to begin with that, right? It's a set of a very small set of folks that have ever been nominated and confirmed to the Supreme Court, and as our audience probably knows, that both Thurgood Marshall and Clarence Thomas have very different judicial philosophies and came to the court from different perspectives and with different experiences. And I think it's very difficult for anybody to suggest that having Thurgood Marshall as a groundbreaking first African-American justice didn't do things for the democracy writ large in terms of framing what the possibilities were of a nation that began with slavery and was followed by Jim Crow, and then through the brave fights and sacrifices of many, many people, began on a march to become a more inclusive democracy and try in some way to begin to deliver on the constitutional promises that for many Americans had been a dead letter. They'd been words on a page and not part of the human experience. And so I think there's no assessment of Justice Marshall's life that wouldn't contribute to the understanding of the experience for Black people in America and for civil rights more broadly, but also in other ways that human dignity is measured. And I mentioned earlier what Justice O'Connor's reflections were when she wrote a tribute to Justice Marshall. And I think it's worth maybe just sharing some of her words, because I think some of this may frame a little bit of what we should be thinking about today. She wrote in a law review article about Thurgood that although all of us come to the court with our own personal histories and experiences, Justice Marshall brought a special perspective. He was the eye of a lawyer who saw the deepest wounds in the social fabric and used the law to help heal them. He was the ear of a counselor who understood the vulnerabilities of the accused and established safeguards for their protection. His was the mouth of a man who knew the anguish of the silenced and gave them a voice. At oral arguments and conference meetings, in opinions and dissents, Justice Marshall imparted not only his legal acumen, but also his life experiences, constantly pushing and prodding us to respond not only to the persuasiveness of legal argument, but also to the power of moral truth. This is what Justice O'Connor, the first female justice, wrote in remembering the contributions of the first African-American justice with whom she served, and it captures it. Of course, Justice Thomas has also served, and among other things, what Justice Thomas's time on the court points to and explains is that there are a range of views, even within Black communities. Not everybody thinks the same on legal matters or other matters. And Justice Thomas, his legal views are not at all consistent with those of Justice Marshall. I think on many legal questions, they've seen things in different ways. And whether we like it or not, inherent in diversity is understanding that not everybody who looks the same or has had the same experience actually thinks the same. And if nothing else, that's one lesson of what we've seen in terms of Black justices on the Supreme Court. But I, for one, am really moved by Justice Marshall's life, his life example, and the way in which he helped make America a better and more inclusive place.
That was awesome. I would just add to Debo's comments, and I'm sure that the question didn't mean to imply this, but I just want to, just sort of state the obvious, that the onus shouldn't be on the Latina justice, on the Black justice, on the woman justice to make sure that justice is done, right? So inherent in that is, well, if one's a Black justice, then the onus is on that individual to make sure that rights are wrong and that justice is meted out. No, that's the role of the Supreme Court of the United States. And I think that's very important for those of us coming from marginalized communities, entering into halls of power and spaces of power, that we do bring that lived experience and perspective, which is so important. But the mantle should not be, and it mustn't be, squarely laid on the shoulders of those individuals to ensure that progress is made. That's the first point. The second point I'll make, though, to the questions, that what I've seen and what I do believe happens is that once you have diverse perspectives entering a room, then it does just change the worldview. It changes the atmosphere. It changes what others in the room, power holders, in this context, justices, it challenges their own worldview, and I believe for the better. So I would say whole writ that have Black justices. And again, and as Debo said, you had Clarence Thomas, who's very, very, just has a very different perspective, right, than Thurgood Marshall did. At the same time, though, I would say that whole writ, by having difference in the room, it challenges status quo, and it challenges, and I'll go back to my earlier comment, it challenges what we very subconsciously believe is normative. And in that way, I just think that, or we hope that, better laws are made, or at least laws that are more reflective of lived experience and the populace begin to be made. And so I think that's just a very important distinction to make, that once she gets on the court, one should not expect that she's now gonna solely in her individual capacity right every wrong that African Americans and Black Americans have ever experienced. It's not fair to her, and that onus should be on all of us, honestly, but in particular on all 9 justices, to make sure that justice is served.
Tiffany, there's someone in the audience who very much agrees with that sentiment, who prior to your making that statement had said, just as race plays a role in the types of questions Judge Jackson will face that non-Black nominees would not, are there ways in which we, as supporters or as the country, are asking more of her role on the court than other non-Black justices, i.e. hopes that she will rally less liberal judges?
Well, and I'll say very quickly, and I don't want to sort of spend too much time here, but when I was on this call with the White House folks the other day, I said, oh, slow down here, because sort of, let's not talk about our enemies, let's talk about our friends for a minute, right? Those who are supporters of hers and want to see her on that bench. Let's make sure that we're not creating this very high threshold, as Amy was just talking about, for Judge Jackson, right? Let's make sure that, we can lead with her being a Black woman, my gosh. And again, back to the earlier comments, what a tremendous time this in this country, not just for Black Americans, but for all Americans. I stopped there because that's important. At the same time, let's lead with, she's 0.001% of anybody on the face of this earth, period. Right? She's already done it. She's already made, she's there. She's already, whether she gets, confirmed or not, she's there already. And I think sometimes, even with our supporters, when we want to lean into different aspects of her identity, it does raise the bar for her in ways that, for instance, white men, it's not raised for them. And even the question about when she gets on the bench, will she be the Black justice? She's going to be an awesome justice, right? But again, let's not put the Superman cape on this one Black woman alone.
Right, and just this may even be the same person because this sort of is in the same thread. It says, are there ways in which the expectations of Judge Jackson on the court are colored by our expectations of gender in the workplace and also of race, i.e. Black women as coalition builders?
I'm just going to say right now, anyone who has done that work of said we need to have different perspectives, backgrounds, race, genders in the around a decision-making table. No, when you're the only one, it's one dynamic. When there's two, it's another. And when there's three, you get to be more of yourself and there's more diversity reflected. We're not there yet with the Supreme Court. We're not there yet with the Congress, but it's a step in the right. It's a step in the right direction. I mean, I have great hopes of having a justice with experience as a woman, as a Black woman, in that table, around that table of power, bringing her perspective, her sharp legal mind, her also her character. She has an impeccable character. Everything she's done in her career really reflects that. So we have great hopes. If you believe in representative democracy, if you believe in like a truly functioning democracy where our government looks like the people who are governed, recognize that Black women who have been here since the founding of this country have been subject to laws going way back to when we were defined as 3/5 of a person. That was the law, all the way to where we are right now, and had never been part of that decision making. So when I said at the beginning that this confirmation process can either make more space for her personhood, that she belongs at the halls of power, or try to constrict it and say that she doesn't belong. And anything based on race or gender, this kind of whole conversation that tries to restrict that, I think is not in service to the kind of country we're trying to build.
Alicia, could I just add one thought on this point? So I guess part of the way we're talking about it and part of the way we're thinking about it is shaped a bit by Amy's frame earlier of thinking both about absence and opportunity, right? And I think part of what we're talking about here and part of where this conversation is going is we're reflecting what hasn't happened. We're reflecting the extent to which there hasn't been a full range of representation and absence on the court, and absence thus for the democracy, and absence in courts more broadly. There have been approximately 3,843 people who have served in federal judges. Fewer than 2%, only 70 have been Black women in the history of the nation. And of those 70, about a dozen were named by President Biden in the last year. So when you begin just by thinking about what hasn't been there, the voices that haven't been there, what hasn't been represented, that's not because people aren't qualified and able. That is because of certain structural factors which have not created the windows of opportunity for them to serve and for their voices and perspectives to be in the room. So when you come from that frame of absence, of being the first, and this is a big part of history of diversity in America for all races, for gender in lots of different ways, there is a set of hopes and aspirations that is visited upon the first almost of necessity, because it's a history-making pick. It is something that's opening up a door and shattering a glass ceiling of sorts. And so part of our thinking goes to what the possibilities of having that structural exclusion taken down can be. And that's part of the conversation. But the other part of the conversation I think we've been reflecting on is that this is a professional who has distinguished herself in service in a variety of roles, and we expect will continue to do so on the strength of her collective experiences and her very impressive legal acumen. And that's going to be something that is going to be all hers, and something that we can't predict today how it will go, and whether or not her jurisprudence will evolve in a particular direction. And so I think it's both hard and fair in the context to have this pent up discussion about what might be, right? In the same way that in the civil rights movement, we thought about what might be. And the way Martin Luther King talked about what would happen if we got the right to vote, what might be. That is what happens when you're reacting to a structural deprivation and exclusion. There's a lot of pent up ideas that get focused in that space. And so I think there's a balance here. It's right to be called out, but it's not entirely wrong to be thinking in these terms.
And Devo, it's not what might be, it's what will be. Because we're now finally at a place where we have this extraordinary judge nominated. And I believe the confirmation process, the White House tells us was the 24th that's going to start of next month. It's coming up.
Right.
And so the way that we can help to express that we will do that is to know that we can make that happen, know that it's been a very long time of activists by, many activists, not just Black women, but advocates for a representative democracy over generations that have led to this moment. And so we can derive hope from that when there's so many sad things that have been happening in this country and the world, especially around COVID and the war. This is a hopeful sign that things will be, that can't, we could go from might be to will be.
And I'll
Tiffany, finish your thought, and then I got one more question.
Okay, yep, I'll finish it. And I just want to just piggyback very quickly off of Davo's comments, because I was sort of like the hallelujah, amen corner over here in terms of how we think about this moment and how we talk about this moment and thinking about in terms of those structural barriers. I think is so important because I think, and this is back to the friends versus the foes, you know what I mean? In that, in some ways, the supporters of Judge Jackson are talking about this as, wow, she's a Black woman, almost as if, wow, I don't want to say a gift, but how nice it is for the president to do this. And again, whether she's a Latina woman, how nice it is, right? And so we have to be careful about falling into that same narrative. Instead, I love the narrative that Davo presented to us in terms of, no, this is a result of structural barriers. Because had right been done from all along, we would probably have, half, if not a super majority of the court would be women, right? You'd have, again, half, if not super majority of the court would be people of color, right? So this isn't a gift. This isn't something that's nice that's being done right now, but this is hopefully, and let's think about talking about and changing the narrative of this is almost a corrective measure in some ways. And we need a whole lot of corrective measures of what has been structural barriers really since the beginning of the country. So again, there are no gifts being done here.
Well, let me layer onto your brilliance some brilliance from Melissa Murray. It's like a dream to have Melissa Murray producing me. She sends in this question. We're going to make it the last question because it's like a class unto itself, which is President Biden didn't have to reiterate his pledge to nominate a Black woman. Could his insistence on considering race and gender be both an act of politics and constitutionalism? That is, at a moment when the court is poised to consider whether the use of race and gender is permissible in the context of affirmative action, is the president making it clear that he thinks there are some uses of race that are permissible, i.e., to your point, to remedy past underrepresentation or exclusion?
This is interesting because I really appreciated what you said, Tiffany, that it wasn't a gift. It wasn't a nice thing to do. It wasn't some D&I affirmative action initiative. This was a very strategic political choice in response largely to the growing political power of Black women and advocating for our own representation on the highest court. Remember 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, when that promise was being made, we remember that the pandemic had started and Vice President Biden was debating Senator Bernie Sanders on stage. And when he made that promise, I felt it, as a Black woman, where the core and the most likely, where 79% of Black women ended up voting for Biden. And when we did a number of listening sessions of Black women and other women of color, we heard that it mattered that he made that promise. It was reflecting a political reality. Now, at that time, he wasn't publicly committing to having a woman of color as a running mate. And so all that was up, in question at that time. So it isn't just a matter of whether, it was kind of, it presented sort of at least in legal terms. The question was kind of in legal terms. When you have, as Debo said, these nominations in the history of Supreme Court nominations have always been made in political environments. And this isn't, kind of a nice, it wasn't like a thing to do just it was a political necessity. It was a thing that underscored how critical it is to have a Black woman's voice. In the Democratic Party, polls have showed that the multiracial coalition of voters who were behind Democrats winning the White House and in Congress, the Senate and the House, looked to Black women as trusted leaders more than ever before. So that's the reality that's happened right now. And we can debate about lots of other policies, but the fact is this had to happen for the president, and that it's happening at the perfect time to re-engage a group of people, we Black women, that are really needed coming up on the election this year and the election in 24.
Debo, final thoughts?
Oh, I would just say very quickly.
Tiffany, final thoughts. Great.
Sorry, yep. I would just say I just saw a question in there that sort of, piggybacks a bit on your response, Amy, about whether he had just said, I'm going to nominate the most, brilliant, qualified individual, and boom, here's Judge Jackson. Personally, I think I would have preferred that. And I get sort of the politics in this and sort of the optics in this and sort of the pledge that he made and being able to say, well, I'm keeping my pledge, and here's a Black woman I told you I was going to find. I found her, right? That's kind of what happened here. I think I would have preferred had he said, I'm going to nominate the most qualified person, and here's Judge Jackson, because I think we are now at a place in this country that's just the truth now, is that you do have diverse people coming from diverse backgrounds who are the most qualified, right? And they happen to be Black, they happen to be a woman, which is so hugely important, but she's just the most qualified, or one of the most qualified. So yeah.
Well, so Debo, I'm gonna land on you and hand it back over to the team at NYU, which is, I think that actually gets back to Professor Murray's question of there is the rationale that this was political and that this was a decision that was shaped by politics. There's also the argument that this is the president sort of tipping his hand and saying, I have a very strong feeling about this question that is about to be before you. Let me play it out for you in real time. Do you think that's at all what was going on here?
My own view is that there's never been a nomination for the Supreme Court that was not political, that it's an inherently political process, and that the presidents are always considering the politics of the moment. They're thinking about their constituencies. They're thinking about their legacies. I'm not aware of any. And if you can go through one by one, you can certainly go back in the modern day. And if you can divorce any of them from some kind of politics, I'm happy to have that debate with you about what the motivating politics were. And so I think that anybody who is thinking about this process as being removed from politics, presidents don't go behind John Rawls' veil of ignorance when they're selecting nominees to represent part of their legacy, people who will serve long beyond their term. It is an inherently political process. The Constitution makes it thus. And the thing I would add to it is that when we think about qualified people and the most qualified person, I also think that is perhaps not the right frame. There are a lot of people that are qualified to do the job. Very often, you only hear discussions about the most qualified when somebody is trying to disqualify a obviously qualified person who has been nominated to speak about somebody else's qualifications. But if you go back and you look at various nominees, in every case, you could think about somebody that had more legal experience, somebody that had more judicial experience, somebody who had a more respect in the bar. And again, it's a political process. What you need is to be qualified. What you need is to be a person of integrity. What you need is to be faithful to the Constitution. And then you need the votes of the Senate to be confirmed. That's what the process is. That's what we'll see here. But I think on the record, and on the record of the United States Senate that has confirmed Judge Jackson many times. They know she's qualified, and I expect that she will serve with honor and with dignity in the highest court of the land as the first Black female justice.
Amy, Tiffany Dabo, I could not imagine a better panel, though I'm pretty sure Melissa Murray is going to jump on any second to rebut and explain what she believes this had to do with constitutionalism. Thank you all so much for doing this. I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Thank you all so much for joining us tonight on behalf of the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network and all of our amazing co-sponsors. We are so grateful to all of you for this expert panel. It was such a treat to hear from all of you. So thank you for joining us. Thank you to our audience for joining us tonight. Thank you to our co-sponsors, the Law Alumni of Color Association, the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law, the Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, the American Constitution Society, the Black Allied Law Students Association, BALSA, the Women of Color Collective, and Law Women. So thank you to all of NYU Law for coming together tonight to celebrate this wonderful panel of experts, this formidable nominee for the Supreme Court Justice. And please join us for future programs, which you'll see on your screen in a moment. And thank you again to everyone for the conversation tonight.